Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PCG, Peace, Cooperation, and Growth, a Philadelphia change effort. My name is Lead Element. Welcome back. In the last episode, we talked about the policy industry and you. We talked about Black Americans engaging in the policy industry, but with the understanding that there are concentrations of private wealth influencing policy in a way that we never could. If you remember, we identified them as top-tier executives, business organizations, lawyers, banking, and professors of international affairs. Now, these groups enjoy ready access to all aspects of our government, each concerned about something called the crisis of democracy. Remember, we talked about how they met. These elements from Japan, North Korea, and America met in Japan, North Korea, and Western Europe met in 1973 to discuss this crisis of democracy. And what is this crisis of democracy? Well, it's blacks, white, ethnic groups, and other minorities in America sticking their noses where those noses don't belong. And where's that? Of course, in policy. And if you recall, the fix they came up with was simply to put us back into our places. And they have various methods to do just that. So the first rule before we mobilize our peace, cooperation, and growth programming is whichever policy is being floated as formulated in your favor, there is likely a hidden counter policy executed to aid the wealthy to undercut you. Historically, this has always been true. An example might be Trump's urban development plan, which I appreciate very much, and I hope to see it thrive, and I hope that we can participate in helping this program thrive. But this urban development plan being paired with the Federal Reserve, just like the Federal Reserve right there in Philadelphia, suddenly extending credit to the underserved communities. Now, why do you think this is? It's because they're seeing the future in ways that we typically don't. They know that if the development plan works, you will likely thrive. But what they want to do is make sure it's their money, it's banking money that you use so that they can suck up your gains. Why am I telling you this? I'm not telling you this to scare you or to discourage you. It doesn't mean that you will fail. It simply means that before we engage our peace, growth, and strategy, before we engage our PCG concepts, we have to account for these traps. These are the traps. And speaking of policy games, did you notice that the law and order policy narrative and the national security policy narrative is often applied to Black Americans in Africa? Why? What is the meaning of this? Well, besides these being signals making white voters feel better during election cycles, these terms help create perceptions that will place Black people in disadvantaged domestic and foreign policy positions. One thing you can count on is that national security and law and order rarely translates to actual security in your communities. So let's talk a little bit about the law and order and national security policy narratives and how it relates to you. Now, the best way to do this is to look at how law and order and national security played out during the fight to end apartheid in South Africa. The law and order narrative, just as it did back in the early 1920s when Garvey wanted to connect Black Americans to African commerce, was used by the media to paint Black Americans who were opposed to the hundreds of U.S. firms helping the white racist government in South Africa to both deny democracy and to exploit Black labor as communist and anti-American. The media helped the U.S. government paint Blacks as communist and anti-American for the simple fact that we did not want to go along with the shenanigans going on in Africa. No, we did not support the exploitation. And so this scheme assisted the White House and Congress to justify resisting U.S. citizen pressure to act towards promoting democracy in Africa, because Blacks are just savage communists anyway. So, in terms of national security, when it comes to Black Americans in Africa, national security for the elites involved in policy essentially means a certain type of anxiety U.S. and European interests may be disrupted in Africa if Blacks get involved in Africa, and therefore foreigners must see to it that this does not happen. When they're talking about national security, they're never talking about Africa's security. They're talking about the security. They're talking about securing foreign interests. And so because U.S. and European firms fear that African resources flowing through a strong economic partnership with Black America, they feared what this partnership would do to strategic African resources controlled by non-Africans. Therefore, U.S. policies were designed to appear sympathetic to Blacks while in fact sustaining foreign power relations in Africa. So this clearly means while Black Americans, white American partners, and others were totally committed to fighting apartheid, the Reagan administration and the U.S. firms operating there, except for Kodak, and even other allies like Taiwan, all faked sanctions and divestments. Sanctions and divestment. What they actually did was pass their operations to local whites so that they can operate in South Africa in stealth mode. And we'll talk more about the tricks Taiwan had played later. So there was no actual sanctions or divestment in Africa. Only Kodak withdrew from the apartheid economy. But then another problem was the first democratic elections in South Africa were actually rigged by the U.S. government and international business. All the major African political parties, including Mandela's, were paid off to help make South Africa's new government appear to be a democracy, when in fact, because its economy was just shipped to other white hands and packaged under a fake democratic brand, everything was simply as before. Nothing really changed. So what we have to grasp right now before launching our peace, cooperation, and growth campaign is the same law and order and national security tactics of the past, making you think, sometimes making you think you are advancing, you are winning, are still in play. This will not be an easy movement. No one is going to simply allow us to engage and freely develop. That's not America. So dealing with policy, you have to, again, develop a critical policy eye. You have to know who the hidden players are, the silent hidden players. So the policy eye requires both a normal and X-ray vision. The dirty tricks are cheap. So these first few episodes are about preparing ourselves. This is boot camp, preparing ourselves for what's coming. I'm speaking the truth to you, and I will leave information in the link where you can read up on exactly what happened during the anti-apartheid campaign and how the U.S. actually undermined that process, and how the entire victory in South Africa was a complete farce. This matters because the old players are still well entrenched in the policy industry, and they do not intend to give you 1 inch. This is Lead Element, and we will meet again.